This episode, I traveled to the coastal island of Hilton Head to dive into the mysterious story of a wealthy couple who disappears without a trace.
The note read, "This goes deeper than Dennis. Stay on it. There are more people involved."
Were they murdered? Were they in witness protection? Did the Russian mob hire a hit? As the days, weeks, months, and even years passed, more questions seemed to surface than answers. Questions involving strippers, secret gambling houses in wealthy gated communities, a potential execution staged as a suicide, and a few names you've likely heard before if you're following the South Carolina Murdaugh saga. Hilton Head is a 12-mile-long barrier island on the southernmost coast of South Carolina in Beaufort County. If you followed my Murdaugh coverage at all, you know it's the same waters Paul Murdaugh and friends were boating around in just a few years ago. Hilton Head is a really unique place. It started becoming developed in the 50s and 60s when a man named Charles Frazier bought land to create the community of sea pines. Charles had a vision of Hilton Head being a premier vacation destination, but also wanted it to keep its cozy, natural coastal vibe. Essentially, he didn't want it to turn into the next Myrtle Beach, which is a very touristy and developed beach on the northern coast of South Carolina. With this vision in mind, the town set strict ordinances. You'll never see a tall sign on Hilton Head. Buildings must be painted in earth tones as to not stick out too much. Any tree with a diameter over 6 inches needs a permit to be cut down, even on your own property. When the iconic Harbortown Marina and Lighthouse were being built, Charles Frazier refused to have the large oak tree on the property cut down and forced the builders and developers to work around it, in spite of the extra cost everyone involved would incur. That large oak tree is called the Liberty Oak, and when Charles passed away in 2002, he was buried next to the tree that symbolized his care and vision for the island. Hilton Head sees lots of tourists, especially in the summer months, but also has a mix of wealthy retirees, locals, or people with second homes that live on the island for parts of the year. It's 2008, and just across the marina from the Liberty Oak and Charles Frazier's resting place was slip number 83, where a boat named the Yellow Jacket was docked. The Yellow Jacket was owned by 47-year-old John and 45-year-old Liz Calvert. They had married in 1988 and lived in Atlanta, but after John semi-retired from working for several power companies, they bought the 40-foot yacht named after John's college mascot and lived in it part-time. They also owned a home in Savannah, Georgia, where the offices for the law firm that Liz worked at were located. John was known to be a perfectionist, full of ideas, and to treat his employees like family. John owned 4 businesses on the island, one of which operated the Harbortown Yacht Basin, another that managed 125 vacation rental properties on the island, and 2 water sport businesses. Liz worked as an attorney at the highly regarded Hunter McLean law firm in Savannah, Georgia. Everyone around her knew she was incredibly smart and quick-witted. Another lawyer at her firm described her as, quote, just first class, as a person, as a lawyer. She cared about the environment and loved animals. A bartender at the Crazy Crab, a restaurant in the marina, was quoted saying the Calverts were as nice a couple as you could hope to find. This sentiment seemed to be shared by much of the employees in the Harbortown Yacht Basin. Another worker who took reservations for water sports said, quote, if Liz is out walking her dog on a Saturday morning, she'll come in here and just sit and talk, shooting the breeze. And a dock hand at the marina said it wasn't unusual for the Calverts to join her and other employees for a cold beer after work. From all accounts, they were genuinely kind and good people. There was a lot of cash flow going through John's businesses, and they utilized the services of a local management company called the Club Group. More specifically, the man who did all of the accounting for the Club Group, Dennis Gerwing. Dennis had been on the island since the 80s and founded the Club Group with a friend of his. He had relationships with many of the most influential people on the island. Dennis was also friends with John Calvert, and they would sometimes have nice dinners or drink expensive wines together. Dennis did have a different reputation than the Calverts among some on the island, though. The same bartender who spoke so kindly of the Calverts earlier was quoted saying this about Dennis. If you had money, he liked to talk with you, but if you were just a regular bartender or a waitress, he wouldn't give you the time of day. One day, when Liz was going over the books, she noticed some irregularities, some numbers that didn't seem to work out right, and it looked like a substantial amount of money might be missing. Whether it was a mistake or not, they decided they wanted to end their business relationship with Dennis. They meet with Dennis a few times over the course of the next few months, and every meeting he claims that he'll be able to bring in some papers that explain everything. On March 3rd, 2008, another meeting is scheduled to take place. They plan to meet at Dennis's office in the Sea Pine Center, just down the road from the Harbortown Yacht Basin. Shortly before making her way to the appointment with Dennis, Liz spoke on the phone with her good friend Terry. She had been telling Terry about the financial discrepancies. Terry remembers jokingly saying, quote, "You better meet him in a public place." Liz laughed and responded that she wasn't worried. John arrives at 6 p.m. and Liz shortly after. But John and Liz weren't seen for the rest of the day. The next day, when both had missed scheduled business appointments and when neither could be reached, Liz's brother filed a missing persons report with the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. It was extremely uncharacteristic of the Calverts to even be late, so to miss a meeting without warning was genuinely concerning. Some friends went over to the Yellow Jacket and let themselves in, but found no sign of John and Liz, and no sign of any struggle. News started spreading around the island that the wealthy couple was missing. This type of thing was not something the cozy coastal island was accustomed to, and as the days passed and the Calverts didn't turn up, the residents became more and more on edge.
And their disappearance has the community buzzing.
Everybody just wants to know a little bit more than what's being told.
It just doesn't make any sense to us. They're just terrific people and really have enjoyed working with John and look forward to working with him in the future.
The officers assigned to the case were Detective Angela Vaines and Detective Bob Bromage. If you're following the Murdaugh case, there's a few people in the story that you might recognize. Bob Bromage, for example, is now the spokesperson for the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, so he's brought us a few updates on the Murdaugh case since it all started to unfold. The detectives seemed to get lots of tips about where the Calverts could be found. For example, a man called anonymously saying that the bodies of the Calverts were in the 500-gallon grease trap at the Quarterdeck restaurant at Harbortown. They went out, drained the entire thing, and searched it top to bottom, finding nothing.
A lot of people that we're interviewing, and we have many more interviews to conduct, and that's going to be ongoing for several more days.
But some tips were helpful, and it wasn't long before they got their first lead. The friend who spoke on the phone with Liz before their meeting with Dennis contacted the police about the situation. When the police looked into the timeline, they also found that shortly after the start of the meeting with Dennis, all digital activity from the Calverts stopped. When the investigators arrived at the club group offices to interview Dennis, he welcomed them back to his office, the same office he had met the Calverts in just a few days prior, their last known location. Dennis cooperated and they chatted for a bit. One of the investigators wrote in the report, "I noted he had 2 cuts on the web of his right hand. I asked him about the cut, and he advised me he cut himself on a wine bottle." The cuts look like they could be slide bite, which is a term used to describe cuts received from the slide of a handgun, often happening when improperly holding and firing the gun. The police questioned Dennis for about 4 hours, and he claimed that he had met with the couple for about 15 minutes the day they went missing, but they said they needed to leave early to get to dinner. A few days later, the police reach out to Dennis again. They want another interview. Dennis, realizing he's probably now a suspect, decides to hire a criminal attorney from the neighboring town of Beaufort, Corey Fleming. If you're new to the channel, Beaufort is actually where I live, and if you're following the Murdaugh story, you've heard the name Corey Fleming many times. Corey was Alec Murdaugh's college roommate, Paul Murdaugh's godfather, Connor Cook's attorney after the boating accident, the attorney for Sean Connolly, who was a name brought up in the death of Stephen Smith, and the attorney for the Satterfield family after Gloria passed. If you haven't watched my Murdaugh series yet, then I'd highly recommend watching it after this episode, as you'll get to see some of the connections between the 2 cases. The links to the videos are in the description below. Fleming obviously advised Dennis to cut all communication with the police, but on March 8th, the police obtained a search warrant for Dennis's home in the gated community of Hilton Head Plantation, his offices in Sea Pines, and his 2 vehicles. In his house, they found a shovel, muddy shoes, and a holster for a Beretta pistol, but the pistol could not be found. They looked through the trash, and while there was trash from several days prior, there was no broken wine bottle to support the statement Dennis made about the cuts on his hand. Dennis had told the police in his first interview that he went directly home after his meeting with the Calverts, but during their investigation, the police found that he had actually gone to a CVS and purchased some bandages for the fresh laceration on his right hand, as well as some latex gloves, before driving to a gas station to buy a lottery ticket and get gas. Just prior to the meeting with the Calverts, Dennis had purchased 3 heavy-duty drop cloths at the hardware store. His cell phone was turned off for about 11 hours following the meeting with the Calverts, so it couldn't be traced. The day after the Calverts went missing, Dennis drove his SUV to an auto shop to have the vehicle completely cleaned and detailed. Evidence seemed to be piling up against Dennis, and not just from law enforcement. When Dennis's business partner, Mark, heard that Liz was concerned about the finances, he immediately contacted Dennis and told him that they needed to hire an outside auditing firm to look at the books and clear their name. Dennis agreed. They hired a firm, and the audit was scheduled to start in the following days. It's March 10th, 7 days after the Calverts disappeared, and the police make an announcement. They are officially looking at Dennis Gerwing as a suspect in the disappearance of John and Liz Calvert. The following day, a prayer vigil is held at the Liberty Oak for John and Liz, and many gathered to pray for their safe return. Right down the road, while the prayer vigil was being held, Dennis was found soaking in a pool of blood in the bathtub of the Swallowtail Villa in Sea Pines, just across the street from his offices. He apparently had taken a steak knife, slashed himself multiple times, and bled out. There were 2 suicide notes found, one written in pen on a bedsheet that wasn't really legible, and another in an envelope that included financial details about John Calvert's businesses, as well as a confession that he stole money from them. There was no confirmation or denial of being involved in their disappearance. This was a high-profile case, and an article I found in the Beaufort Gazette described the scene this way, quote, "Top law enforcement officers, 14th Circuit Solicitor Duffy Stone, and others arrived at the condo in a blizzard of blue light and blaring sirens." Solicitor is South Carolina's version of district attorney, and Duffy Stone was elected in 2006, taking over after 3 generations of Murdochs held that position for almost 100 years. Stone was there not just as solicitor, though, he was actually a known friend of Dennis Gerwing. An investigation into Dennis's records uncovered that he had taken a total of $2.1 million from the Calverts and 7 other of his clients. While the case is technically unsolved, the police believe that Dennis killed John and Elizabeth Calvert at their meeting on March 3rd before moving their bodies to his SUV. They believe the next day he drove somewhere within a 5 or 6 hour radius and buried the body along with the murder weapon, most likely the missing Beretta handgun. Though aerial, canine, and dive searches were conducted, to this day, the Calverts have never been found. In November of 2009, John and Elizabeth Calvert were legally declared deceased. While it seems easy to conclude what happened and Dennis's motive for the murder, some people speculate that it may not be so simple, as some of the circumstances around Dennis's life and suicide could suggest there's a lot more to the story. When a news crew that was at the prayer vigil down the road heard about Dennis's death, they drove over to report on the scene. As they were leaving, they found a note placed on the news van.
The note read, "This goes deeper than Dennis. Stay on it. There are more people involved."
So how much more is there to this story? Let's start with the alleged suicide. Found in the villa downstairs on the counter was a half-drunk bottle of wine. Seems to fit Dennis's MO, as he loved wine, but those who knew Dennis knew he loved red wine, and the bottle found downstairs was a bottle of white, leaving suspicion that someone else was there. Dennis's body was transported to the Medical University of South Carolina for an autopsy, where it was ruled a suicide. The head of the school's autopsy department, pathologist Dr. Aaron Presnell, said in an Island Packet article that they generally look for certain things to determine whether a death was a suicide. She said, quote, "With suicidal sharp force injuries, you don't typically see any defensive injuries. You also could see different non-fatal sharp force wounds." She was pointing out the fact that Dennis didn't show any signs of a struggle with another person, only had the cuts on his body, some of which weren't fatal. If someone killed him, she believed there would be a struggle and defensive wounds to show for it, and the killer would likely only inflict cuts intended to be fatal, and Dennis had what she described as hesitation cuts. But Aaron Presnell has had some controversial rulings before, not just in the public's eyes, but in law enforcement's as well. If you're following my Murdoch series, she was the pathologist that ruled Stephen Smith's death a hit and run. Here's an excerpt concerning Aaron Presnell from my video on Stephen Smith. Multiple agents from the Highway Patrol tried to speak with the pathologist in an attempt to understand why she disagreed with the coroner. Here's an officer's report. The reason I went and spoke with her was due to a preliminary report where she stated that the victim was possibly struck by a motor vehicle mirror, which was the cause of death. Sergeant Moore had already had, from my understanding, a heated conversation with her about this issue. She stated that she could not even begin speaking with me about this case without the coroner's consent. I advised her that I had spoken with Coroner Washington the day before, and she basically called me a liar, and she said she would call him right then. When I asked if she wanted me to call from my cell phone, she backed off. I asked her why she stated that in the report, and her answer was because he was found in the road. She had no evidence other than that for the statement being put in the report. I asked her if someone with a baseball bat could do that, and she stated no. When I probed further, saying, "What about someone in a moving car with a baseball bat?" she stated, "Well, I guess it's possible." As I was leaving, she stated that the report was preliminary and it was my job to figure out what it was that struck him, not hers. So at this point, it seems clear that it wasn't a gunshot wound that killed Stephen. It was blunt force trauma. However, the circumstances surrounding the blunt force trauma were still very unclear. And because the pathologist ruled it a hit and run, the Highway Patrol ended up in charge of investigating what everyone but the pathologist believed to be a homicide. Back to Dennis. Here's a diagram of the bathroom he was found in, provided by the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, and an excerpt from the police report. Quote, "The adjacent small bathroom contained a stand-up shower with a full-length glass door and glass wall, perfectly clean. Opposite the shower was the sink. Abundant dried blood covered the entire top surface of the sink, with additional blood noted on the front of the sink cabinet and large drops of blood on the white tile floor. The entire floor, from the sink area to the bathtub, was totally covered with smeared dried blood, with approximately 7 to 8 alternating footprints, similarly sized, approaching the bathtub. The rather short, deep tub contained the decedent facing upward, lying upon the apparent bedspread. The body was unclothed. Both legs were bent at the knees. The entire top surface of the tub was covered in dried blood, as well as the decedent's body. The right arm and hand was covered with extensive blood. Linear, streaming, small blood droplets were observed on the wall behind the tub, to the left of the decedent, extending up the wall above the tub for approximately 12 inches. The wall to the right side of the decedent and tub revealed a much larger stream of blood droplets, extending upward in an arc approximately 4 feet in length. These droplets formed an arc from the top of the tub near the decedent's head, upward over a large picture and continuing further upward towards the feet." End quote. Essentially, there was blood almost everywhere. Lying in the tub near Dennis's right hip was a steak knife with a black handle. Dennis had multiple large and deep cuts on his body. 1 4-inch cut on his inner thigh, 2 2.5-inch cuts on his left wrist, a 2-inch cut on his right inner calf, and his lower neck had 2 deep gashes, one that measured over 5 inches and another that measured over 6. Essentially, it looked as if someone had cut his throat twice. Dennis's brother, who saw the photos, said, quote, "The wounds on Dennis's body, when you look at them, it doesn't make any sense. It was a very vicious attack, much deeper than you would learn from just reading the autopsy report. It's hard to believe anyone could stand that pain." The SLED report said he probably took 12 to 20 Benadryl. He had 500 milligrams of Benadryl in his bloodstream. He had to be groggy at best and probably passed out. Why the coroner doesn't make more of that, I don't know. I've got to believe there was some other party involved. I could see Dennis saying, "I'm going to take these drugs, then you can kill me. Make it look like a suicide." The Russians may have wanted him out. They could have fed him the drug and made it look like others did it. So who are the Russians that his brother is talking about? To answer that question, let's take another look at the life of Dennis Gerwing. As the police kept digging, they found that Dennis was a regular at the strip club on the island, at the time called the Diamond Club, now called Cheetah. It was at the Diamond Club that he met Russian stripper Laura and began an interesting relationship with her and her husband Rob. A close friend of Dennis sent a statement into the sheriff's office after his alleged suicide. Here's a few excerpts from that statement. Since Dennis's death, I've been racking my brain, trying to figure out why someone so smart and so comfortable could take his life. I noticed some changes in Dennis over the last few years. At Hinoki, a restaurant on the island, one night a few years ago, Dennis let me in on his little secret. He was seeing a married woman and had been seeing her for a while. Her name is Laura and her husband's name was Rob. He told me that she was a dancer he had met at the Gentlemen's Club here on the island. He said he had been apprehensive to tell me about her as he didn't want to ruin our friendship. I told him that we have always been great friends and I would never judge him as long as he was happy. I was happy for him. I didn't want to judge, but it was a very strange situation. Rob knew that Dennis was seeing his wife intimately and supposedly supported it. Dennis and Laura would travel together and Rob would fix some dinner when they returned like it was completely normal behavior. Rob would call Dennis to chat like they were great friends. I never told Dennis, but I didn't trust these people. I had a bad feeling about them and didn't really want to hang around with them. Rob was scary to me. The only time we all spent an extended period of time together was on a trip to the Kentucky Derby. He said he was in special forces and described how he used to kill people. Laura seemed to have some sort of spell over Dennis. In July or August of 2007, we were having dinner at Hinoki and the conversation got a little strange. He told me that he was going to help Rob and Laura start a business with Laura's uncle or father. I can't remember for sure. He said it was an export business where they would buy old cars and send them to be sold over in Kazakhstan. I said I thought that sounded a little risky, and what did he really know about her uncle or dad? He said he had researched it and it looked like a good investment. I didn't like it. Later on, her statement ends with this. I started getting phone calls from friends around 5:30 p.m. Tuesday evening telling me that Dennis was dead. It was a shock then, and it's still a shock to me today because I know Dennis and he would never kill himself. I know he did, but there is too much mystery around this whole suicide and Calvert disappearance. I don't trust Laura and Rob or anyone involved with them. I feel like they're involved with everything. I don't know if any of this will help, and I will try to remember anything of importance and pass it along. The more I look back, I really believe that Dennis kept things vague for my protection. So what was up with the export business to Kazakhstan? Locals have speculated for years that this was a drug or money laundering front for the Russian mob, and possibly they were using the cars to conceal money sent back to Kazakhstan. On March 3, 2008, just hours before the Calverts disappeared, Dennis asked for a favor from an employee of his. He said he needed her to drive his car and he would drive his SUV to the local airport so that they could leave his car there for some friends who were flying in later that day. So who are these friends? Could they be linked in any way to this export business to Kazakhstan? Could they have played a part in the disappearance of John and Liz or the death of Dennis? The police did do an investigation into all of the planes that came and went that day and could uncover nothing of significance. Another of Dennis' vices was gambling. It's confirmed that Dennis regularly traveled around the country to gamble, but rumor around the island was he also attended a private and secretive illegal gambling house in the upscale gated community of Wexford. And more rumors claimed that he even flew to Russia a few times to gamble. I couldn't substantiate any of these rumors, but when looking at information about the Russian mob and the rest of this story in context, I can see why people would think those rumors might have some validity to them. When looking up the Russian mob activity from 2001 to now, I read, quote, "Around the world, Russian mafia groups have popped up as dominating particular areas. Russian organized crime has a rather large stronghold in the city of Atlanta, and Russia was branded as a virtual mafia state, according to the WikiLeaks cables." Remember, Atlanta is just a few hours from Hilton Head and is where the Calverts lived for years. Here's a bit more on an arrest made in 2017 to give you a better idea of how the Russian mafia operates. Keep in mind, we know Dennis embezzled millions, and he was involved with a Russian stripper to export used cars to Kazakhstan in the former USSR. On the 7th of June 2017, 33 Russian mafia affiliates and members were arrested and charged by the FBI for extortion, illegal gambling, narcotics trafficking, wire fraud, fraud on casino slot machines, murder for hire conspiracy, and cigarette trafficking. They were also accused of operating secret and underground gambling dens and using violence to those who owed gambling debts, establishing nightclubs to sell drugs, and plotting to force women associates to rob male strangers by seducing and drugging them. When I read his suicide note through that lens, I couldn't help but to feel like it was trying to explain everything away, to make it simple for the police so they wouldn't dig any further. I mean, he flat out says, gambling not related. And here he explicitly states who did it. I alone created and benefited from the various scams. He even reiterates that in a PS at the end of the note. PS, I have acted completely alone in all actions committed. I knew the risks of this happening and believe taking myself out of the game is the best way to move everyone as quickly as possible past all events. All anger should be directed towards me. Burn my body and dispose without service. When I read that, the first thing that I pictured in my mind was a co-conspirator of the financial crimes standing over Dennis and forcing him to say that he did it on its own. Is that my imagination just running wild? It could be, but like Dennis's brother Fred, things do just seem odd. I honestly don't know if Dennis was involved with the Russian mob. All we have is what looks like the right conditions for it to be true, but no solid evidence for it. In the reports that I got from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, there was a report on why they ruled this a suicide that had some really interesting points in it. In that report it read, quote, if homicide is to be considered, one would have to accept that the deceased passively surrendered, resigned himself to his fate, and while nude, waited until the offender located and retrieved the knife from the kitchen and cut him several times. Research also showed, reports said, that people sometimes commit suicide with chainsaws and by setting themselves on fire, possibly exceeding the extreme pain of a kitchen knife and multiple violent, jagged thrusts. The sheriff's office also obtained a search warrant for Laura and Rob's phone records and even got Rob in for a polygraph test. Rob passed and nothing could be found in either phone records to indicate they were involved in the disappearance of the Calverts or the death of Dennis. The police have received more tips over the years, and there were 3 that I found to be really interesting. In 2011, both the FBI and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division received an envelope in the mail with a note that read, concerning the disappearance of the Calverts, please find enclosed map of Eastover, South Carolina. Check within 100 feet of the warehouse, especially the encircled area, 3 to 4 feet deep. When the remains are recovered, take note on who owns the property. Additional information forthcoming concerning Calverts, Gerwing, and others. Bob Bromage and a team from the University of South Carolina Archaeology Department searched the property in hopes to find and bring an end to the mystery of what happened to the Calverts, but nothing was found. They did find that the property was owned by Forest Investment Associates out of Atlanta, Georgia. The original founder/investor of the company, a man named Charles, sold his remaining shares in 2008. I wasn't able to find out much about Charles, but I did find that him and 2 others started a firm in the 80s around investing in timberland. He did later live in Bluffton, which is just across the bridge from Hilton Head Island. But I couldn't find any connection to Dennis or the Calverts. The report said they planned on interviewing Charles, but no interview was included in the reports that I got from the sheriff's office. This is another one that ended up raising a lot more questions than it did answers. There was a few emails from a family that was on vacation at the time of the Calverts' disappearance. Here's a few excerpts in an email from a woman named Darla. Angela, my family was vacationing on Hilton Head when the Calverts disappeared March 1st through March 7th. We went to Orlando, Florida on Saturday, March 8th. We stayed at the Marriott Grand Vista Resort. While there, we saw the Calverts on March 13th between 11:30 and 11:45 a.m. We contacted 911 immediately. We have been paying close attention to this case since we had just come from Hilton Head. My family got a very good look at the couple in the pool area. The family members who saw them are positive it was them. The couple seemed to realize they had been spotted. The man looked scared. They left the area as quickly as possible on foot. My brother and his wife and also my 20-year-old niece got a close look at them before they took off. They are absolutely sure that it was the Calverts. My family is willing to talk to whoever is investigating this case." Her brother Tim sent a similar email as well. On March 26, 2008, a woman from Beaufort contacted law enforcement with some really interesting claims. The police report says, quote, "He met with Zamfira and she explained that she was involved with a person she identified as Brock. She continued and explained that during her encounters with Brock, he admitted to her that he killed the Calverts and that he was paid $100,000 for the job. She stated he claimed to be a hitman. She also stated later that she saw Brock digging a hole in his backyard with a tractor and believed he buried them there. If this was true, this could finally be the break the police were looking for. They asked Zamfira to take a polygraph test and ask her these questions. Did you lie about Brock telling you that he was hired to kill a wealthy couple who lived on a boat on Hilton Head? Answer, no. Did you lie about Brock showing you a check for $100,000 in February? Answer, no. Did you lie about Brock digging a trench in his backyard? Answer, no. So what were the results of this polygraph? No deception indicated. She passed. Excited with this new lead, the police set up a sting operation and recorded phone calls between Zamfira and Brock, where they capture Brock on audio admitting to the murders. But there's a problem. Brock's story is riddled with inaccuracies. The police set up a meeting with Brock, and when asked about admitting to the murders, the report states, quote, Brock replied that Zamfira likes to play games. He said that stories like that are foreplay for her and she gets very excited. He stated that he tells her these things because it boosts her sexual desire, end quote. They give Brock a polygraph test and he too passes, and after further investigation, his story seemed to check out. It's tough to know what to make of everything when looking at some of these cases. Part of me knows that the crazier the story sounds, the more people will be interested in it. There's incentive for the reporters who were telling the story at the time, and for myself telling it now, to see the most salacious answer to the various questions we have in this story. The answers that are the most interesting aren't necessarily the most likely. But every time I go down that thought trail, my mind seems to take another turn. Crazy stuff happens in this world, and just because answers are interesting doesn't make them untrue either. And that's kind of the thought circle that my mind goes through when researching and telling these stories. One thing I found kind of interesting when researching for this case was the death of Charles Frazier. He was on a chartered or rented yacht in Turks and Caicos. When the yacht exploded, Charles, along with his wife, daughter, and a few others, were thrown from the boat. The authorities said that because of the injuries from the explosion, Charles was unable to swim and drowned. I couldn't find much more on this incident, but it seemed really odd to me. How often do yachts just explode? Could there be something bigger than even the Calverts and Dennis and Charles Frazier going on behind the scenes on Hilton Head? I don't know the answer to that question, but I hope by attempting to tell these stories, maybe the truth can come a little more into focus. On September 7th, 2008, a boat called the Spirit of Harbortown set off from the marina with around 80 of the Calverts' friends and family. The purpose was to raise money for a reward fund in hopes that someone would come forward to solve the case. But the trip also served almost as a wake. As the boat moved through the Calabogue Sound, with the sun setting over the low country, they laughed and cried as they thought of their dear friends John and Elizabeth Calvert, clinging to the hope that answers would come. But as of today, 14 years later, we still don't know what really happened to John and Liz Calvert. I referenced a few people that cross over from the Murdaugh story into this one. I've heard speculation that this is evidence of corruption running deep in the systems in place here in the Low Country. I felt it necessary to say that while that could be true, it's important to remember that the people mentioned in this story and the Murdaugh story, attorneys, solicitors, pathologists, all have careers that deal with crime. So it shouldn't be seen as a huge coincidence that they would be in two major stories occurring here in the Low Country. If you enjoyed this video and feel I've earned it, I'd be honored if you subscribed and liked this video. I did file a Freedom of Information Act request and got all of the documents from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, but one of the many resources I used to make this video was a book called Deceit, Disappearance, and Death on Hilton Head Island by Charlie Ryan and Pamela Martin Ovens. If you want another perspective on this case, it's a really interesting read and I'd highly recommend it. If you liked this video, I think you'll find this two-part series on a beheading in Georgia absolutely fascinating. I spoke with the sheriff that was involved in investigating this case, as well as a former member of a cult that might have played a part in this murder. You can check out that video here or YouTube's recommended video here. Love you guys. See you in the next one.